Pong Diplomacy. 50 years ago, it helped China and the United States forge a new relationship. But how did table tennis players make it all happen? And why does it still resonate today? Hello, I'm Mike Walter, filling in for Anna Naidu, and this is The Heat. As the World Table Tennis Championship Finals take place in Houston, Texas, we're reminded of a historic moment from 50 years ago when the finals were held in Japan. It was 1971, and relations between China and the United States were strained. But before the major political breakthrough that came with President Nixon's visit to China a year later, competition in the form of sports was already playing a diplomatic role. Table tennis, to be precise. It became known as Ping Pong Diplomacy, and it all began in April 1971. With a chance encounter at that big tournament in Nagoya. American player Glenn Cowan missed his bus, so he jumped aboard the Chinese team bus to catch a ride. He was greeted by world champion Zhang Zidong, who gave him a gift. The story made news in China, and the U.S. team was invited to visit. Days later, the Americans arrived in Beijing, becoming the first U.S. group to do so since the founding of the People's Republic of China in 1949. And they played before enthusiastic crowds. Ping Pong Diplomacy was born. Meanwhile, political diplomacy was also making progress. U.S. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger made a secret trip to Beijing in July of 1971. And U.S. President Richard Nixon would make his historic visit to China in February 1972. A few months later, Chinese table tennis players toured the United States. They traveled the country, playing exhibition matches with their U.S. counterparts. Warmly greeted by Americans, the spirit was friendship first, competition second. The Chinese showcased their skills at the United Nations in New York, and they visited the White House as Ping Pong Diplomacy's little ball helped move the big ball, all part of building a new relationship between China and the U.S. One of those who was directly involved with Ping Pong Diplomacy is Jan Barris. She is the Vice President of the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations. In 1972, she traveled around the United States with the Chinese team and delegation during their visit. I talked with her recently about that experience. Well, why don't we start at the very beginning? Because when you think about Ping Pong Diplomacy, it started with this chance encounter, and I'm sure people have asked you about it many times. But talk to us about its genesis.
Well, the genesis that I think most of the world didn't know about was that both the Chinese and the Americans were thinking back in 1970, certainly after President Nixon was elected, sort of contrary to expectations. He felt it was important to have some connection with China, that it was a mistake for the two countries to be so totally cut off from one another. And Kissinger has said in his books and elsewhere that right after Nixon was elected, one of the first foreign policy things he wanted to turn to was trying to do something about the difficult situation between China and the United States. And so there were various signals that were sent out along the way from the United States and a few from China. And it turns out that Ping Pong Diplomacy, in retrospect, was one of those signals. There was an American team that was in Nagoya, Japan. The American team that was in Nagoya, Japan to play in the World Table Tennis Championships. And there were a lot of interesting sort of coincidental things that happened, like an American player who slept late. He was sort of a hippie kind of guy, and he slept in one day and he missed his bus. He missed the bus that was taking the American team from the hotel where they were staying to the practice. So he just ran outside and jumped on the first bus he saw, and it was the bus with the Chinese team, which surprised him, but he was a pretty happy-go-lucky guy. So he thought, well, this is cool. But the Chinese were very taken aback. Nobody knew quite what to do. And the leader of the delegation, China's most famous player at the time, a man by the name of Zhang Zidong, screwed up the courage and came to the front of the bus and started engaging with this American player. And later on, Zhuang Zedong said that he had recently read that Chairman Mao had given an interview to an American reporter. So he figured if Chairman Mao had done that, then he could go talk to this American ping pong player. So the two of them sort of walked off the bus together, and Glenn went off to his practice. The Chinese went off to their practice. But the next day, Glenn thought it would be cool to thank the Chinese. So he came and brought a peace T-shirt that he gave to Zhuang Zedong. And the press somehow got wind of this. There were pictures all over the place, and everybody was buzzing about it. And then, to everyone's surprise, about a day or so later, just as the teams are about to depart to go back to their respective homes, Zhuang Zedong surprised everyone by extending an invitation from the Chinese team to the American team to stop off in China on their way back to the United States, because China was holding an Asian international table tennis, well, I guess not international. China was holding an Asian table tennis tournament, and the Americans were invited to come visit China and participate in that tournament. And that was the beginning of ping pong diplomacy.
Talk to us about how you got involved, because this really changed the course of your life in many respects too, didn't it?
In June, I came back to the United States for home leave. I was home in Detroit, and I got a telephone call from two of my professors from the University of Michigan, where I had gotten my undergraduate degree and my master's, asking me to consider taking a year's leave of absence from the Foreign Service and going to New York and working at an organization called the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations, which was going to be co-sponsoring, along with the U.S. Table Tennis Association, the visit of the Chinese ping team to the United States. So the second half of ping pong diplomacy. While I was considering it, this was June, July of '71, Richard Nixon came on television on July 15th and announced to the world that Dr. Kissinger had just come back from a secret trip from China, and that as part of that agreement, the Chinese ping pong team was going to be coming to the United States in April of '72. He was going to be going to China, and I thought, well, it probably now, this is all really happening, and so it might make sense for me to take a year's leave and go up to New York and work on the ping pong trip, which I did.
What was the response from Americans? Because, this was a time when there really weren't any relations between the Chinese and Americans. So this was kind of, this was new territory. So describe for us the reaction of Americans.
I wasn't quite sure how the American public would react. And in fact, several people in the media, we had a lot of media coverage for this, not just the Chinese, but American press, and we had people from all over the world actually traveling with us. And so invariably, the media and Americans who met with the delegation, because we tried to put together a program that gave the Chinese opportunities to meet with not just the Dr. Henry Kissinger or President Richard Nixon, but also with ordinary Americans, and made a point of doing a wide range of activities that would allow that. So a lot of just everyday folks would come in contact with them, or journalists. And of course, one of the questions that was always asked by the Americans to the Chinese is, well, what has surprised you most, or what's left the deepest impression, or what have you encountered here that you didn't expect? And I overheard this question being asked by numerous kinds of people in different places. And at first, I heard the Chinese saying, oh, we're really impressed by the warmth and hospitality that have been shown to us by the American people. And so I have to say that while I'm not a cynical person by nature, but I thought cynically at the time, well, this is probably what they've been told to say. This was sort of the first initial days when I was consumed by details and didn't have a chance to step back and see things. So I thought that's a nice sentiment, and that's part of the talking points they were given before they left China. But I found that as the trip wore on, and as I had a chance to get out and engage with the Chinese along with the Chinese, with the Americans we were meeting along the way. I must say I was impressed by that as well. And I was very proud of my fellow countrymen and women because for the most part, people were very, very warm. They were very gracious. They were very hospitable. They were very curious about China. They had lots of questions. And I came away feeling that one of the things that impressed me most on the trip also was the warmth and the humanity that was shown on the part of the Americans. And I must say the Chinese reciprocated in kind. I think that, as I said before, they weren't only good table tennis players, but they were also very good ambassadors for China.
And so you traveled around with the Chinese team, and when they left, there were tears on your part, which I know later you were told about that from people in China. Talk to us about this experience. What are your vivid memories of it? And talk to us about the emotional feeling when getting so close to this team when they left, what it was like.
Well, I tend to be a pretty emotional person anyway. I cry easily at movies and other things. But this was, first of all, I was together with the group from, I think, April 7th or 8th they arrived until the 28th of April. They came for a 3-week formal visit, and then they stayed on for another week in California. And so traveling with the delegation, being with them every day, I had gotten to know several of them very well. And when they left, I and several others were very sad to see them go. And the team was made up of people who were really not just extraordinary ping pong players, but they were also warm, friendly, interesting, fun people. And I had been able to establish I speak Chinese, not as well as I would like, but enough to be able to talk to them without using an interpreter, although we had 6 interpreters traveling with us who were very helpful in lots of different situations. But when they left, after having been together so closely, 24/7 for almost a month, I was very sad to see them go. And so there were a few tears at takeoff, and there were Chinese documentary crews who both remained on the ground after they left and were on the plane. And so the first time I went to China was May, June of 1973, about a year after the ping pong team had been to the United States. And I would be traveling around, and invariably at least 2 or 3 people every place, in every city we went, would look at me and sort of, I'd see them looking at me and watching me, and then one or two of them would venture up to me and say, "Oh, I recognize you," sort of in Chinese. "我认识你，你是那位哭的小姐。I know you. You're that girl who was crying." And when they first said it, they just said, "You were that crying girl." I didn't know what they were talking about, but then it turns out they had seen this documentary of me waving farewell and tears streaming down my face.
Jan, we just have a couple more minutes. I do have to ask you this question because just listening to you, I think there are defining moments in our lives, and this clearly was one for you. How do you think it shaped you as an individual, and what was the lasting legacy or lesson from people-to-people exchanges, do you think?
Certainly, ping pong had a profound effect on my life, sort of ping pong and then everything that came after. And in terms of people-to-people relations, I can't stress enough how important I feel those are. There's been, in the United States at least, some questioning about this period of engagement that we've had with China and who it's benefited, and has it only benefited China and not the United States. I think that is a totally fallacious argument. I think engagement and people-to-people exchanges have benefited both countries and both peoples enormously. And especially at a period like today, when the Sino-American relationship is not as robust or as positive as it has been in years previous, although I believe that the summit, the digital summit that the 2 presidents had, was very important step in sort of calming the situation and stabilizing the situation. But I think that it is so important to keep the people-to-people exchanges and people-to-people relationships going. And there is an enormously deep and wide sort of depth and breadth of that kind of personal interaction and people-to-people exchange between our two countries. And it's more important than ever in a day when the two governments aren't necessarily at that same level.
Well, Jan, I will say this people-to-people exchange was fantastic. So great to hear your recollections, and I can't thank you enough for talking to us.
You're welcome, Mike. Thank you for having me on.
And for more now, we are joined by former U.S. Ambassador Chaz Freeman. He was the principal American interpreter for President Nixon's visit to China in 1972. Also with us from Beijing is Victor Gao. He is a chair professor at Soochow University, and he served as an interpreter for Deng Xiaoping. Joining us, too, from Oregon is Yanliang. She's a professor of economics at Willamette University. Welcome all of you to the show. Victor, let me start with you because we got Jan's perspective. The Chinese come to the United States, but this all started with the U.S. going to China. I want to get the perspective from Beijing. Just how groundbreaking was this, and how did the people in China view this?
Thank you very much. I personally know Jane Barris as well as Ambassador Chaz Freeman, so allow me to use this opportunity to express my personal greetings to them. Now, on this anniversary for the Ping Pong Diplomacy, it is truly, from the Chinese perspective, a very major landmark event. Why? Because China and the United States were estranged from each other from 1949 all the way to 1971. And China and the United States used to look at each other as hostile forces. And then, boom, you had this ping pong diplomacy. You had the American team visiting China and eventually the Chinese team visiting the United States. Now, from the Chinese perspective, when we welcomed the U.S. table tennis players to China, we were all very much dazzled and very much amazed because the American players were exactly like the Chinese players. They were human beings. They didn't wear horns on their heads, and they could smile. They behaved just like us. And eventually, it put a human touch on America as a country, on the American people as human beings. So I think this caused enough chemistry to develop eventually, leading to normalize the relations where China and the United States would recognize each other, and people started to visit each other. Lots of Chinese students started to go to the United States to study, and this opened the door between these two great nations, enabling the huge relations to develop. And by now, China and the United States are the two largest economies in the world. And in this process, I think we need to focus on the people-to-people exchanges between these two countries. No one can cut off such human-to-human exchanges and friendship between these two great nations. It all started with a ping pong diplomacy.
Well, Chaz, let's start with that because there's the old saying, the little ball moved the big ball. How much did ping pong diplomacy move the political diplomacy, do you think?
Well, it was actually an accident, as Jan mentioned. Guy got on the wrong bus, and a whole series of events flowed from that. And the interesting thing was that Nixon and Kissinger were kind of upset about the invitation for the ping pong team to go to China, because they had been working behind the scenes in great secrecy to develop an opening to China and eventually a presidential trip to China. And they feared that the ping pong team's attention, the attention it was drawing in the press, would blow their cover. And on the Chinese side, I understand, initially when Chairman Mao was told about what had happened, that the head of the team, actually, the American team, had suggested to the Chinese team that perhaps they could go to China. His initial reaction was to brush this off, and he told Zhou Enlai, the premier, take their names and get their addresses, and we'll be in touch with them maybe. But then before he went to bed, he had a second thought, and he called Zhou and he said, no, invite them to China. So on both sides, this was a surprise. And it was a very fortunate one because, indeed, we had many reasons to get together after the long separation that Victor Gao mentioned. and it changed the world. That this accidental friendship between ping pong players burgeoned into something really important.
Well, and Chaz, to kind of piggyback off what you were saying, you know, here's this guy, Glenn Cowan, who ends up, he oversleeps, he gets on the wrong bus. This causes this chain of events. But I imagine Kissinger, with all this delicate work going into place, probably thinking, you know, if this guy can end up on the wrong bus, maybe there's going to be a faux pas with these athletes. It could really blow up everything. From what I understand, he was kind of concerned about that as well, wasn't he?
Yes, I think he was. And of course, getting together after the long period of mutual hostility and isolation that we'd had was a very delicate process. We'd had a very hard time finding channels of communication. The question of Kissinger's ultimate trip to China in July of 1971 was under discussion, but there had been no response from the Chinese. And Kissinger and Nixon really didn't know what to make of this.
Oh, very interesting. Yanliang, I want to get your thoughts on this, because when you look at ping pong diplomacy, it opened so many doors, created so many relationships and friendships, as both of these other gentlemen have pointed to, and Jan as well. Just how important has it been, and how important is it today, given the tensions we're seeing between these two governments?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, you know, politics aside, we see these people-to-people exchanges as so beautiful, and they're so valuable in enriching and improving our lives. And I think more importantly, I think what this history has shown is that, you know, once that relationship has been established, it's impossible, if it's not, you know, very, very difficult to close the door. And I think, you know, when both countries face, you know, the common challenges, they work together. And so I think today the common threats, the common challenges loom even larger, you know, ranging from, you know, climate change to pandemics to, you know, nuclear non-proliferation. All these issues call for collaborations and cooperations, and for both countries to work together like they used to.
You know, Victor, it's really interesting. The Chinese team came here to the United States. They were treated like rock stars. There was a reception at the White House. Nixon and Kissinger were there. They played at Cole Fieldhouse, which is not far from Washington, D.C. 11,000 seats sold. It was like the most coveted seat you could get. The president's daughter was there. The Secretary of State was there. It was quite an event. And then, you know, what's interesting about it is the people-to-people exchanges, which we've talked a little bit about. I interviewed Jimmy Carter back in 2014, and he talked about how this wasn't lost on Deng Xiaoping, that Carter got a phone call at 3 o'clock in the morning from a diplomat in China, and here he wakes up out of a dead sleep, and he's like, what's going on? And he says, well, Deng Xiaoping wants to send 5,000 students to the United States universities. And Carter was so mad, he said, tell him to send 100,000. And Deng Xiaoping did just that. And we've seen this for decades now, this kind of exchange, and it's been very important, hasn't it?
Absolutely. I think what happened surrounding the ping pong diplomacy involving both the American athletes coming to China and the Chinese athletes going to visit the United States were well documented and have been carved in stone in China-U.S. relations, forming the foundation for our bilateral relations. I had the great pleasure of working for Deng Xiaoping in the 1980s as one of his English interpreters, and I know for sure how much importance Deng Xiaoping attached to this China-U.S. relations. He always believed that peace and development and mutual respect and appreciation should prevail between China and the United States, despite of whatever difficulties. And there were grounds for China and the United States to get their acts together, to cooperate for not only their mutual good, but also common good for mankind as a whole. I think this kind of commitment to China-U.S. friendship and exchanges continues today. Circumstances changed a lot in the 1970s to 1980s versus what we are facing today in China-U.S. relations. But I truly believe the Chinese people and the American people are not enemies with each other. We are friends with each other. At the very bottom of our hearts, we have tremendous amount of goodwill towards each other, and we cannot allow politicians to poison China-U.S. relations. We need to really reveal to each other our true intentions of friendship and goodwill towards each other. And I truly believe so long as the Chinese people and the American people stand together, there will be no obstacles in the world that we cannot overcome. This is as relevant today as it was 50 years ago.
Relevant today, Chaz, in the sense that the U.S. Table tennis team is taking on China. The championships are going on in Houston, Texas. And actually, this year we'll have a mixed team of Chinese and U.S. players playing together, which is remarkable. Can this sport rekindle things 50 years later, in a sense?
I wish it could, but I think the attitudes in both countries have been very badly deformed by basically a lot of disinformation, as well as some serious problems. And I think it's very encouraging that after a long period of no dialogue whatsoever at the top, President Biden and President Xi Jinping have begun a dialogue. That's essential. Without talking to each other, there is no way we can restore the kind of relationship we ought to have. And I agree very much with Victor Gao that the potential of the U.S. and China working together is enormous.
Yanliang, the last question for you. Glenn Cowan, who went on that bus accidentally, died in 2004. Zhang Zidong died in 2013. Many might just see them as footnotes in history, but do we owe them a debt of gratitude, do you think?
Absolutely. I think, as noted very well earlier by Jen, all these people and people exchanges, they remain really relevant, and then they leave really important footprint and legacy as to the rest of us trying to, do our part to foster that friendly and cooperative relationships going forward. Going back to what has been said, there are all these very significant and common global challenges that really require the two biggest economies to work together, despite all the differences. Again, I think these two great powers have to durably coexist. This is the reality. But Cold War or not, our friendly cooperations, constructive cooperations are policy choices. Yes. And I hope that two country leaders can build that relationship forward towards the common good.
And we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you all so much. It's been a fascinating discussion. And thanks for watching another edition of The Heat.